Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. I'd like to offer the somewhat unconventional wisdom that you don't actually need to forgive people. And of course, this isn't wisdom that stands alone. I have something to offer instead. But when it comes to forgiveness, I think that self-forgiveness is very important and very valuable and can be kind of tricksy. But we sort of have this narrative, I think it is kissing cousins to toxic positivity, that basically says you need to forgive people. And there was a movie that I enjoyed. It was overall forgettable, kind of light and playful, but the story arc of personal growth, had a woman who, her father's begging for forgiveness after having made some really bad choices, very much for his own sake and his own well-being. And toward the end of the movie and the point in the, sort of classic story arc where the crisis is happening that then, brings all the threads together, he interrupts her and is begging to be forgiven. And she just looks at him and says, "No, I don't forgive you," and goes on with her life. But what's really important about this and what makes it a triumph is that she is not being fussed with him going forward. She's, as is often the personal growth via Hollywood, she's gone through some stuff and come into being more herself and more in her own lane. And that clarity is kind of worked into it. So I would say that rather than working toward forgiveness of places where you've had an experience that has resulted in either harm, it can be harm, or it can just be, something that really worked your last nerve or a pet peeve. This can come up a lot in romantic relationships. It can come up in business relationships. It can come up with, just fundamental energy exchanges that we have with other people. And we have a lot of chemistry and wiring that has to do with there being in our internal chemistry system really high stakes for how it goes with other people. So particularly if you're in a female body, although I also know some men who are very, very sensitive to social rejection, especially for women prior to menopause, interestingly, there's a lot of reward and punishment chemistry related to other people liking and approving of you. One of the mandates, particularly of cave women, to stay safe is be pleasing, avoid displeasing. And the bigger the power imbalance or perceived opportunity or how you really wish this romantic relationship would go a certain way because the other person is just so hot, whatever it is, that this can really, really be amplified. And so when we get yanked around by our own chemistry that can make us feel amazing or awful, we as humans are a little bit less likely to function in the most elegant, balanced, frontal cortex, thoughtful kind of way of moving through the world. And the kinds of things that people can feel really bitter about, it can be genuine harm that has happened. Physical violence, really bad situations, damage of property, loss of money. It can also be social rejection. There can be people who make it their mission to poison your relationships in a community and have you, thrown out, or at least an effort. I went through one really bad breakup that had that story. And at the time I was pretty pragmatic about it because I knew the person really well and really just took if they know me, then, they're not necessarily going to believe untrue things that are said about me. And I had some painful surprises of who did believe, some things. And I probably, in my heightened state, attributed rejection where there may have just been awkwardness. But the upshot was that, I was able to move to the other side of this. So, first of all, I don't want to make light of how painful it is when we have a disappointment, a rejection, harm is done to us. There's an interaction where we showed up in good faith and the other person really didn't. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, there are episodes of me trying to navigate having rented my condo out to a woman who turned out had a drug habit. I don't know how long it extended, but there's reason to believe that there was never a window of sobriety, which I did not accurately clock at the time. And she ended up not paying rent. And because of the COVID regulations, I was forced to just have her there non-paying for a really long period of time. And she was committing all kinds of identity theft. There were drugs left behind. It was a whole hot mess. And so the first kind of piece of what I want to offer is it's really useful to let yourself feel the feelings, feel the anger, the sadness, the disappointment. And on a biochemical level, a certain amount of anger in a contained way, like moderate outrage, can feel kind of invigorating, but it has a really short shelf life. And it's kind of interesting how much people consume content and information and things that kind of stir the pot on their low-level outrage. It's just a very human thing to be like, ooh, I don't like what I'm feeling. I can distract by whatever I'm miffed about with politics or, offended with this. And not everyone who cares deeply about politics or this, that, or the other thing is doing that. But it's a good mechanism to recognize as emotional avoidance in ourselves and others when there's that, going to low-level outrage. But a lot of times, that gets out of hand and people go into, much bigger anger, and that doesn't tend to feel particularly pleasant when, we're kind of in that land. And grief just really sucks. It's such a universal thing. There can be a beauty and a connectivity in it, but it's one of my biggest shadow emotions. Tired and grief are the two that I most prefer not to feel. And ironically, suppressing emotion and ignoring emotion creates fatigue. So there's sort of a catch-22 when I'm having some grief that I'm trying to tune out or not feel. So when you've been harmed, and it doesn't really matter whether the harm feels proportional to the emotional reaction, because when something, really hits us deeply, a lot of times it can have old emotional debt of things that we weren't able to process originally. So in moving forward, with or without forgiveness, your call, but in a way that is really congruent and healthy and aligned for you, the first step really is that processing the emotions is important. And it's helpful to do that in a place where you're not having something that sort of fans the flames. So a friend of mine went through a divorce a year or so ago, and I'd been talking to him about his very complicated marriage for a long time. So I could be in the compassion of like, oh, wow, I hear this is hitting you a lot harder. It's really impactful. And I just really see how these two humans co-created this outcome. Whereas another person who was in the military structure, who he actually ended up having to discipline for how she was trying to take revenge on her ex at one point, was like, I can't believe her. She's horrible. And, and I'm like, well, you have a choice of who you call up when you want to process. She'll be raw, I'm on your side, and I'll be like, wow, I really hear that you're in pain, and I just, wow, I see that was something that happened. So in the short term, the wanting to vent and, vilify the other person for a very, very short duration might feel kind of gratifying, and that's cool. It's just not ideal to stay there. And one of the things that I think is so important when we have a massive misalignment with another human, and it can be that they objectively did something absolutely reprehensible and are going to go to jail now for it, or it can be something that has more ambiguity depending on who you're talking to and what facts are or are not presented about the situation. But when we when we have this, it's just we're really challenged by the neurological and the biochemistry and all of those kind of things. And so the survival part of our brain pays attention to big negative emotions as potential survival threats. And so the trouble with staying in the rumination place, this isn't the raw emotional processing. If you need to have a good cry, go for it. But a lot of people don't want to go down all the way into the depth of the emotion so that they can come out of the valley and up the other side. And of course, I should throw in a caveat that, if you're going into dangerous territory and you wouldn't be safe with that level of emotionality, definitely get some help, some support, some structure. But if you're just going through some big emotions, the big emotions are fine. It's the fact that we, as humans, tend not to sit very long with big emotions, so we sidestep into rumination and organizing the information. And, the whole denial and bargaining stages of grief, which incidentally are not linear, they can pop all over the place, really kind of represent the fact that we sort of would rather ruminate and think about something and try to figure it out, which is an adaptive survival mechanism. If you're like, oh my goodness, I stuck my hand in this rock and I got bitten by something and my hand swelled up and that sucked, you do want to ruminate on, the series of events that led to this. But when it comes to relationships, there can be a place for really looking at things, but probably not when the emotions are running high, because when the emotions are running high, there's still a really big vested interest in sometimes restoring the relationship, sometimes vilifying the other person. You're just not in a place to really harvest. I had a partner years ago and we had this house together, which, was in a lot of ways a lovely experience. And we got into the project of like creating a garden and we planted some mint. And then he was so excited about the new mint that he wanted to go down and harvest it. But these were still, little plants that were about the size of, a baseball. So it just wasn't time. You have to let the mint grow before you can harvest something useful. And similarly, in the heat of emotion, it's just really useful to know that we're not going to do our clearest thinking. And so letting the water settle and getting to more neutrality is really helpful. And the trouble with rumination with high emotionality is that it creates neural pathways in the brain. The brain's like, oh, important survival information. And I've known people who are decades out from a grievous offense, that it's not a small thing when, your husband with whom you have children cheats on you with your best friend and then goes back and forth between the two of you before finally ending up with her. But once the children are having children of their own and it's been decades and you're still having this so top of mind, that is problematic. And people don't want to be there. It's unattractive to witness. They're the thing where somebody's going over and over and over the same territory is hard to be present for, even if you really care about the person. A lot of us can hold space for a while, but when it just becomes kind of chewing the cud on this old idea, it's hard to hold space for, and it's even harder to hang with ourselves. And so I think people try to grab forgiveness and kind of come up with a false forgiveness, kind of a, if you have a well and you put a board over it, you're like, no, it's filled in. It's not actually, quite as resolved under the surface. But it's just really useful to kind of know that there's a good reason for this. There are these mechanisms. And so it's really useful to really work with yourself to go back to the emotionality and away from the rumination. And sometimes verbal processing can be useful. Everybody kind of has their own aspect of getting over something. But over time, going over it and over it and over it isn't all that helpful. And it was interesting to me that at some point the condo story, it feels kind of boring and stale. I'm just not that interested in it anymore. I had a lot of people who witnessed me and heard me with a lot of compassion, but most of the time I don't even think about it. And there were a lot of steps that went into that I want to illuminate, at least some of them for you. But in lieu of forgiveness, I'm really interested in neutrality. And so neutrality is just a really cool thing where there just isn't biochemistry related to the thought. So if your ex who behaved horrifically badly and stole your stuff and damaged relationships and cheated on you and everything else, if he or she, did all of those things, and then a couple of years later they cross your mind and you're like, oh yeah, that was tough. I didn't like that much, but so it goes. That neutral. And it doesn't, again, that's not about forgiving him. One of the things that just kind of makes me cringe is when people talk about the people that they're really triggered with, where they're still working with their emotions, and they decide to send love and light to that person. And the person, quote unquote, receiving the love and light quite possibly could perceive that as a psychic attack. They're just not in your fan club. And the diversity of the world means that in a lot of cases we have an unprecedented opportunity to just go be somewhere else when something isn't working. And I know that doesn't apply across the board. Obviously, we couldn't rehome ourselves in childhood if, the vibe wasn't to our taste. But as adults, we have a lot of opportunity with that. But our brains don't know that, because in hunter-gatherer times, you had the choice of make it work with the tribe you were born into or die. And that was pretty much, with very few exceptions, the gig. And so what we want to do ideally is process the emotion, do our best to not have these established neural pathways of going internally through our argument with the reality of what this person did over and over and over again. If we do have those neural pathways, we want to dismantle them. And before I go on, I just want to emphasize that holding a grudge is very seldom volitional. Now, there are people who that's part of their identity. They're like, if you offend me, I'm going to be, your enemy forever, or I'm never going to get over it, and that's kind of, a sense of self that they've developed. And that's its own thing. I would have a different conversation about, like, is that really serving you as a, way to be in the world? Because that also generally has the coin of extreme loyalty on the other side. No matter what you do, I'm going to stand by this person. And that just doesn't give us the sort of freedom of movement. If there's somebody that it has gone horribly with, I just want to cut the cords. I don't want to have any of my energy going to them. I don't want to receive any of their energy. I want to, really get back in my own lane and be doing me in a way that doesn't involve participation. And so for me, when I've been connected with someone and it's gone badly, I know that I'm complete when they've just returned to the category of, may all beings be well. Like, I just, genuinely want humans to thrive in the world. And they're humans I'm deeply invested in. I have clients, I'm like, oh, I so want this to, go well for you. And loved ones and friendships and acquaintances on Facebook. And, there are varying degrees of me personally and passionately wanting good things for individuals, but I also just have this generic, may all beings be well. I want people to have food and shelter, and I want animals to be well, and I want rivers to be well. And there's a sort of non-attached, general centered principle with that. So in one particular really bad breakup, it was, a good year and a half before this little tiny part of me that kind of wanted him to grow a persistent toe fungus gave up the ghost and made it into neutrality. But for me, there's this mirror that just says, okay, I still have more work to do. If there's a clenching of the stomach or a rush of emotionality when this person comes to mind, and that's just data. That's just information. We come by it honestly. So the self-compassion for grudges you're holding, and the compassion for people who've gotten really locked into this. A lot of people don't have the tools, so they try to gloss over forgiveness, or they try to do the love and light thing, which means they're still participating with the person. They're top of mind. They're sending inappropriate energy. If you think about someone that you just, are appalled by and deeply dislike and never want to see again, you probably wouldn't love them sending you love and light. So soapbox moment, let's not send love and light. Let's go for neutrality. Let's go for eliminating cords, because that sending of love and light keeps creating cords and pathways between you and somebody you don't want to be connected to. And then working with the brain. The brain does better with adult supervision, and it can be tricksy to provide it with adult supervision, but there are a couple of tools that I think are really, really darn useful for providing the brain with adult supervision and telling it like, hey, prune these neural pathways that are devoted to railing at the wrongness of my ex, or this horrible boss that I had, or this incredibly selfish, sibling, or, whatever it is. I hear a lot of pain points with people, and where there's still really an argument with reality about how a person is being in the world is one of them. And therapists, of course, are going to offer the really important take care of yourself aspect to this. So this could look like boundaries. Boundaries can get overused in a lot of ways. A lot of times people are thinking of something as a boundary, which is more like I get to dictate how you do you and call it a boundary. And that's not actually what is intended. So qualified feedback can be really helpful in terms of mapping how you want to navigate the fact that there are people who you need a great deal of distance to be neutral with, and how you want to accomplish that and navigate it and work with it. I personally love delving into relationships in session, because there's so much life force and possibility and ripple effect for all the other relationships that have smaller versions of something that's inelegant that can get unlocked with these kind of things. So I've paid a lot of attention to it in my life, and I think it's a really, neat area to pay attention to. So you have to ideally, there's the processing of emotion. There's also the setting yourself up to not be hurt by the person again. And part of why I have a lot of neutrality about the woman who was in my condo for a while is because I have absolute faith that, she can't disrupt me again. Now, I know our brains can come up with these terrible scenarios of stalkers and whatnot. Our brains are good at dramatic stories and bad at statistics, and we have a lot of fiction where we're trying to process the emotions we're not dealing with, which is cool. I'm not against that. But the overall, future you could deal with somebody showing up and being a problem in the very specific way that they're being a problem. I have a whole podcast on trusting future you, so that can be an assignment that you pass to them. But contemporary you, having a strategy or a way to be okay with this individual. And it's super sticky and complicated and much beyond the scope of what I'm talking about if you're sharing underage children with an ex with whom you had a very bitter and unpleasant ending. That is way more complicated. But for a lot of different things, also family dynamics can be, particularly complicated. But overall, in general, there's the process the emotion, then there's the problem solving. How do I take care of myself given that, this is so-and-so's way of being in the world? And then we want to look at those neural pathways. And so once you've solved the safety question of I know how to keep myself safe, or I have something I want to try about keeping myself safe, and we'll see how this goes, then we want to the usefulness of ruminating on it, like the example back many minutes ago of sticking your hand in a crevice and getting bitten by something. You don't want to keep thinking about that after you've perhaps reasoned out that maybe you should make sure you have clear visual availability to see where you're putting your hand before you stick your hand there, or maybe you want to wear gloves, or, all of these, different things. I'm in a, go through everything I own and see if it's in a contemporary relationship to me cycle. And I have these outdoor storage bins that are very functional, but you better believe I put on gloves before I started, gathering things out of those to take a look at them. So that person who had that experience isn't going to be, 6 months later constantly thinking about, this adverse experience, ideally. And so we just need to give our brains a little facilitation to kind of put that down. A dog with a bone chewing on it. We're like, we want to have that set down. And there are a lot of different things you can do. Some of them, if you pay attention, you give your brain a different essay assignment. So paying attention to wonder, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but doing a gratitude journal, there are double-blind studies and all of that do really, really show that, yes, even though it's super annoying to, really find authentic gratitude when you're in a grumpy kind of place, it does rewire the brain. And there are lots of other things, that we can reach for. Getting back into our passion, remembering things that we love, getting excited about something, getting into our creativity, starting to learn a new skill. There are really cool ways that we can, just coax the brain's attention away. And parents of, children at a certain developmental stage are really good at that. The child's about to wail because you took away your glasses and aren't letting them eat your glasses. And then you're like, oh, but look, here is a shiny, fun rattle. You could have the rattle. And they're like, ooh, rattle, Of course, as we get older, we're like, no, I wanted to eat the glasses. That's the only thing that will satisfy me. So having some humor about the weird wackiness of humans, I think is really helpful. I'm a big fan. There's a fire ceremony on the articles page of my website. You'll find it under the resources tab, the articles page that is, and has many different things, but fire ceremony is one of them. And a week of fire ceremony or 21 days of fire ceremony, if you're like, wow, I am just tired of being crippled by how deeply angry I am at my mother, putting the anger at your mother into the fire and inviting what you want. And it's a really specific process. This is a magical ritual. There's a form of self-hypnosis. It's an energetic intervention. So don't just make up your own fire ceremony. I mean, you can. Symbolism is great, but, for the, really, really focused dismantling, that is really helpful, and that will help with the neural pathways in your brain. You can also on the fly do the transmutation breath, where you breathe whatever you're triggered about into your heart chakra and exhale neutrality. And I believe it's in the Elegant Trauma Release. I think I go into more detail about that, so you may want to, check it out in that podcast. I got the transmutation breath from a teacher and facilitator I really like named Sean Roop. So if you go check out his stuff on tantraquest.com, somewhere he probably can point you to where he explains it way, way, way better than even I do. But that's a really good one where you're working with that. Other things like Tong Lin, Pema Chodron teaches that, where you're pendulating back and forth, is really useful. So a lot of times I think with forgiveness, there's an aspirational value of I want to, feel this peace with what happened and good feelings toward the person. And I think it can be a kind of a toxic positivity to try to have good feelings instead of neutral feelings toward someone who has been a really bad match for you in some way. Another piece that I think is really important, remember I said previously, when you're in the heat of the moment, don't try to harvest, what you can learn. You gotta give it some time. And in the fullness of time, I think it's really useful to circle back and find your part in it. And this gets a little bit more complicated if you were a child, but there may have been a need that you were trying to meet that exceeded something else. And certainly with our adult choices, even if objectively, if somebody like had a video of absolutely everything you did and absolutely everything the other person did, they would be like, wow, that person is a piece of work. That is reprehensible. I don't think they're psychologically healthy. Even if that's the case, you can probably harvest something that is your part in it. So the really painful relationships, there was probably some element of soul connection for me that had me being, really persistent. With the situation with the condo, I could find where niceness, laziness, wanting to give people who earnestly wanted to get her life on track an opportunity for something that, she really wanted, cognitive bias that made me think I could manage the property, which, I did more or less successfully. I could not have anticipated, COVID and all the legislation that came with that and how the courts were backed up. And, there's just a lot of crazy stuff that wasn't mine. I just don't have relationships with people who are using heavy duty illegal drugs, and, crack and meth were, parts of her world. And so I feel like when she signed the lease, she might have been high as a kite, but I just don't have that filter. Whereas someone a little less naive about drugs would have been like, oh, she's tripping. And it would have, potentially gone really differently. Or the niceness where I have this really unregulated person and I'm like, oh, this isn't the best idea. So the thing about being able to find your part is it doesn't excuse the other person, but it allows you to trust future you to deal with a situation more elegantly and not get hurt in that way. So it's a much more sophisticated version of like, oh, I probably shouldn't stick my hand in, that, rather than like hating spiders or scorpions or they're so horrible. You could go that way if you stuck your hand somewhere you couldn't see and something bit it, but you could also go the way of, oh, the reality is this is a thing that's in the world. My discernment has been improved, and I just really trust, that I'm not going to participate in exactly that way again. I have some really good information. So harvesting that is really useful. One of the things that I'm absolutely adoring is something called burned haystack method. And Jenny Young, the person who established it, is getting ready to release her book, so that'll be out. But there's a really vibrant Facebook group of women, and she's using rhetorical analysis to reveal very early on things that people don't even realize that they're revealing about themselves, so that, women can ideally avoid predators or even just unsatisfying relationships. And it's really cool and interesting. I just love her geekiness, and she's good with satire, and she's really passionate. But through this method, she's also come into a relationship that she is currently just absolutely delighted with. And there are all these success stories of women who, just by not engaging with people who they were able to discern were unqualified really early on, went on to not be so exhausted and fed up with, the craziness of the apps, that they've met people. There are a lot of engagements and marriages and committed partnerships and people who are just glowingly happy that are coming out of this experience. And so one of the, things that's emerging is women finding more ability to trust themselves in making really good and ideally safe choices for themselves in the dating realm. And when we do this harvesting of what was my part, or what did I miss, or what could I learn from this, that self-compassion is really important. Like just looking at yourself with kind eyes. There was Katie in her 30s was so hungry for deep, meaningful, really being met in connection, that when someone implied that they wanted to share that with me, even if their actions said something different, I went all in on just using a ridiculous amount of energy and trying to make things work. How when we were kids and there were the rides at the fair, there was this, you must be this tall to ride this ride. And, I have you must be this psychologically healthy, et cetera, and so forth, with different contexts. But I can really see where sometimes, because of chemistry or soul connection or feeling wanted and chosen, I just didn't, or just lack of discernment, just, sometimes just lack of experience. I didn't have that bar for psychological health as high as it was. And sometimes it was just a timing thing, of like, well, if there aren't glaring red flags, it just takes a while to get to know someone well enough. And so I just now have a lot of self-trust. And I think that one of the things of getting to that neutrality in lieu of forgiveness is self-trust of like, yeah, I know how to take care of myself. I know how to, have a really good opportunity to make sure that I'm not hurt in that way again. And that helps the brain put down the rumination and the thinking it over and all of those kind of things. Another sidebar, it's such an interesting process when I'm creating these recordings because I've just been working with, these magnificent teams of guides for a really long time. This is year 26. And I recently looked up when my part-time engineering job went away, and that puts me at 19 years of this being my full-time jam, which is kind of cool. But they're just sort of all like taking turns where this one steps forward and gives me a thing and okay, now share this, now share that. And one of them is just to notice if there's emotion that you don't want to feel, going into old grudges and judgments of others and all of that is very seductive. And it's not something we decide to do. It's not like we're like, oh, I have this grief and I will really support my physical health and my vitality if I just sit my butt down and be with these emotions. I've gone to therapy. I've onboarded skills to do this. Even when we've done that, we can, without even thinking about it consciously, just find ourselves ruminating on an old done me wrong kind of thing that is old and stale and really outdated in a lot of ways. And sometimes there's just more to process with the thing. I try to be really careful about not ruminating on people that I have charge with. But sometimes in the shower, I'll find myself even imagining a hypothetical situation that I would be really mad about or annoyed about or could work my way through, and imagining how I would do that. And I'm like, that is a crazy thing to be thinking about in the shower. But it really just reflects the fact that I often go really far in the dream time and move a lot of stuff around. And if I'm tired, even after I've drunk my ration of coffee, I will sometimes, just poke my internal chemistry, get a little bit of low-level righteous indignation going to be able to kind of focus and stir myself up. So recognizing that, again, lots of self-compassion, but it's a really common thing sometimes to have a vested interest. There might be something you're really scared about as far as a life change. There might be a place that you got really hurt. There might be a relationship that isn't going as well and you don't want to look at it. There might be a part of your life that's becoming unsustainable. There might be a health diagnosis that, intuitively you're like, I know something's not right here. I should probably take a look at it. And the discomfort of really getting present, with a financial or a health or a relationship difficulty can have us going sideways into our petty offense file or our not so petty offense file of arguing with the reality of how someone else participated with us or in our lives or in the world at large for that matter. And this is one of the places where qualified feedback is really helpful. So part of how I keep myself honest is having someone that I talk to regularly who can, see where I'm avoiding something that really needs some attention by kind of going off in the weeds or getting into playing out emotional reactivity in another area to deal with emotions that I'm not dealing with directly in the particular place. So if you do find that you're really struggling with grudge holding or judging other people or not forgiving yourself, I'm passionately pro self-forgiveness and unconditional self-compassion. I am not necessarily pro forgiving other people. I'm pro being no longer harmed, being fully restored, coming into a version of yourself that is, thriving in the world and all of the layers of that, and having these people who, harmed us often in very significant ways become immaterial. And that's a journey. And I think some of the seductiveness of forgiveness is it feels like a bypass for really coming into restoring your sense of self and your sense of safety and cleaning out emotional debt and some of these things that can be really uncomfortable and can be really confusing for how to do. And yet there is so much value in being able to be in that neutrality and being able to just really come back to doing you all in your own lane in the most, elegant, engaged, aligned way possible, and investing in future you being in an even cooler place than present you is in. So that's my hot take on forgiveness. Forgiving of others, overrated. Strive for neutrality, strive for an energetic neutral zone, and strive for coming home to yourself. Activate really deep self-trust, improve your discernment, see where your patterns are so that you can make elegant, aligned, up-to-date contemporary choices in all of these complicated dealings that we have with other humans. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.